The black maid warned the Mafia boss of a hidden shooter, and his look at her was nothing he'd ever shown before. Naomi Carter had been working as a maid at the Castellano estate for the past year, a job that kept her invisible in the grand scheme of things. She was the quiet observer, the one who cleaned the marble floors and polished the furniture that shone brighter than the life she'd ever known. For Naomi, working in the opulence of the Castellano home was a far cry from the cramped apartment she had grown up in, but it was a paycheck that allowed her to send money back home to her mother. As she stepped into the grand dining room, carefully balancing a tray of drinks, she noticed the tension in the air. Guests were gathered around the long, polished table, their laughter echoing off the walls. At the head of the table sat Dominic Castellano, the youngest Mafia boss in the city, a man whose reputation struck fear into the hearts of even the bravest. Naomi had learned to stay out of his way, not that she ever had the chance to get too close. But today, something was different. Her instincts were on edge. As she passed through the room, her eyes caught a glimpse of movement near the back corner. It was subtle, almost undetectable, but Naomi had spent enough time in dangerous places to know when something didn't feel right. A faint silhouette stood in the shadows, just behind one of the large windows, holding what looked like a weapon. Her heart raced. She could see the faint outline of the gun, barely visible in the dim light. Naomi's breath caught in her throat as she took in the situation. There was no time to hesitate. She had to act. Dominic Castellano, a man who could end her life in an instant, was sitting just across the room from the threat. Naomi knew this wasn't just a moment of fear. It was a moment of life and death. If she stayed silent, Dominic would never know what hit him. But if she spoke up, if she warned him, she could very well seal her fate. Still, something deep inside her told her to take the risk. She moved toward the table where Dominic sat, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. As she neared him, her hands began to tremble. She had never been this close to him before, never had this much power over someone so dangerous. With a deep breath, she leaned over and whispered softly in his ear, "Run now." Dominic's dark eyes snapped to hers, narrowing as he processed the urgency in her words. For a moment, the room seemed to freeze. His usual cold, calculating expression shifted into something Naomi couldn't quite place. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was something entirely different, a flicker of understanding, maybe even trust. He didn't speak, but his gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary, as if considering whether to believe the words of a maid who had never once spoken to him directly. But Naomi didn't have time to wait for his response. She watched as his hand subtly moved to his side, where the gun was always within reach. The tension in the room increased as Dominic rose from his seat, his movements sharp and decisive. His eyes scanned the room, and for the first time, Naomi saw something more than the Mafia boss. She saw a man who was vulnerable, not because of his power, but because of the life he led. He nodded once, just barely, to his bodyguards, who sprang into action. Naomi felt a sense of relief flood through her, but it was short-lived. The danger wasn't over yet. She had just done something no one else in this world would have dared to do. She had warned a man who could have ended her life in an instant. And as the chaos began to unfold around them, Naomi felt a shift in the way Dominic looked at her. It wasn't just about the threat she had uncovered. It was about something deeper, something unspoken between them, something he had never shown anyone before. Naomi had never imagined that a single moment could change the course of her life. As the chaos around them unfolded, she felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. She had just warned Dominic Castellano, the most dangerous man in the city, about an imminent threat, and now, she was standing there, watching him move with the precision of a man who had been trained for situations just like this. As Dominic's bodyguards began to clear the room, Naomi couldn't help but notice how different he seemed. The cold, calculating Mafia boss she had only ever seen from a distance was gone, replaced by something more human, more vulnerable. Naomi stood still, her heart pounding in her chest, unsure of what to do next. Her whole body was shaking, but she couldn't let herself appear weak, not now. She had to hold it together. As the bodyguards ushered everyone out, Dominic glanced back at Naomi, his eyes meeting hers for just a brief second. It was almost imperceptible, but Naomi could see it. Something had shifted. The look he gave her was nothing like the dismissive stare she had grown accustomed to. There was no hint of the cold indifference that had always marked his interactions with others. It was something new, something she couldn't quite understand. Dominic moved toward her with purpose, his stride confident yet measured. He didn't say anything at first, his gaze still fixed on her as if he was trying to process what had just happened. Naomi felt a strange knot form in her stomach. This was the man who had controlled empires with a single word, the man who could have her life erased in an instant. And yet, here he was, standing before her, seemingly at a loss for words. "You did well," Dominic finally said, his voice low but surprisingly soft. Naomi blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. She had never heard him speak to anyone like this before. The tone was almost respectful. Naomi opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She had warned him. She had saved him. But what did that mean for her? What would happen now? "I'm not used to being warned like that," Dominic continued, his voice a little more steady now. "You've earned my respect, Naomi." The words hit her like a wave, and for a moment, she felt like the floor had been pulled out from under her. Dominic Castellano, the Mafia boss, had just said that he respected her. Her mind was racing, trying to process everything that was happening. Naomi had always been invisible in this world, just another face in the crowd, another servant doing her job and staying out of the way. But now, for the first time, she felt seen, and it terrified her. Dominic took a step closer, his eyes still locked onto hers. "You saved my life tonight," he said, quietly, "and for that, you'll never be the same. No one who's seen the truth can go back to the way things were." Naomi could feel her pulse quicken. What was he saying? She was still just the maid. She had no place in his world. She had no power. She was still at the mercy of the very man who now seemed to be looking at her like she was something more than just a servant. "I didn't ask for any of this," Naomi whispered, her voice trembling. "I only did what anyone would have done." Dominic's gaze softened. "Not everyone would have," he replied, his voice low but sincere. Naomi felt a strange warmth spread through her chest, but she quickly pushed it down. This wasn't real. This wasn't her world. This was a world of danger, of power, of violence. She couldn't let herself believe for even a second that she mattered in it. "What happens now?" Naomi asked, her voice barely audible. Dominic's eyes flickered, as if he was considering her question carefully. "You'll stay here tonight," he said. "You'll be safe. After that, we'll talk. We need to make sure no one knows what happened here." Naomi nodded, though her mind was still spinning. Safe. She had never felt truly safe, not in her entire life. And now, she was in the one place she had always avoided, closer than ever to the man who could destroy her with a single order. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw something different. She saw the man behind the mask, the one who had been forced to grow up too fast, the one who carried the weight of an empire on his shoulders. "You're not like the others," Dominic said softly, breaking the silence between them. "You're not afraid of me. You've been nothing but honest with me. That's rare." Naomi felt a lump form in her throat. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was pretending to be someone she wasn't. She wasn't just a maid, a servant. She was someone who had made a difference. And in Dominic Castellano's eyes, that meant something. "Thank you," Naomi whispered, the words feeling foreign on her lips. Dominic gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. "You don't owe me anything," he said, his voice almost gentle. "But I owe you." Naomi's heart skipped a beat. What did that mean? She couldn't fathom it. She couldn't understand what was happening between them, but for the first time in her life, she didn't feel completely invisible. And that, in itself, was enough to leave her breathless. Naomi sat in the quiet corner of the estate's grand living room, the weight of the evening still pressing down on her chest. Her hands, still trembling, rested on her lap as she tried to process what had just happened. Dominic Castellano, the man who controlled everything in this world, had looked at her, not as a servant, not as the maid, but as someone who mattered. It was surreal. She had never been seen like this before. In all her years of working, she had never once been acknowledged beyond her duties. She was used to being invisible, to blending into the background, never drawing attention to herself. But tonight, that had changed. The thought felt both thrilling and terrifying. Naomi had been around powerful people before. She had seen how they moved through the world, with an air of dominance and control. But Dominic Castellano was different. He wasn't like the others. There was a quiet intensity to him that she couldn't ignore, and it had nothing to do with his reputation. It was something deeper, something Naomi couldn't quite place. She wondered if he felt the same way about her as she did about him. Her mind drifted back to the moment she had warned him, to the look in his eyes when he realized what she was doing. It wasn't the cold, detached gaze she had come to expect from him. It was something else, something soft, almost vulnerable. Naomi had never seen him like that before, and it made her question everything. Was this a turning point? Was this the moment that would change everything for her, for him? She couldn't afford to think like that. It was dangerous. She had always kept her distance from people like Dominic, knowing that getting too close could be her undoing. But now, she wasn't sure if she could keep that distance. Naomi had saved his life tonight. That wasn't something anyone could just walk away from, was it? She had done something that few people would have dared to do. She had trusted her instincts, even when it meant putting herself in danger. And now here she was, sitting alone in a room full of luxury, questioning her place in it all. She heard footsteps approaching and immediately stood up, her heart racing. Was it Dominic? Was he coming to speak to her again? She felt the familiar weight of anxiety in her chest, but it wasn't the same as before. It wasn't the kind of anxiety that came from fear. It was something different, something more unsettling. The door to the living room opened slowly, and Naomi looked up, her eyes locking with Dominic's. He stood there for a moment, silently watching her, as if gauging her reaction. His usual cold demeanor had softened, and Naomi couldn't help but feel the tension in the air between them. "You're still here," he said quietly, his voice low but steady. Naomi nodded, unsure of what to say. "I didn't know if you were going to leave," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic stepped into the room, his presence filling the space. He didn't speak for a moment, his eyes scanning the room, then settling back on her. Naomi couldn't help but notice the way he moved, graceful, calculated, but with a certain weight to his every step. He wasn't just a mafia boss. There was something more to him, something that went beyond the surface. "I owe you more than you know," he said finally, his voice rougher than usual. Naomi's heart skipped a beat. She had expected him to thank her, but this felt different. She hadn't done anything extraordinary, had she? She had just done what felt right. But the way he spoke made her question that. "You didn't owe me anything," she replied, her voice steady despite the way her heart was racing. "I just did what anyone would have done." Dominic's gaze softened, and for a moment, Naomi saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a flicker of emotion that she wasn't sure she was meant to see. "Not everyone would have," he said quietly. Naomi felt a knot form in her stomach. This was too much. She couldn't let herself get caught up in this. She had to stay focused, stay distant. This wasn't her world. She wasn't supposed to be here. "Why did you warn me?" Dominic asked, his voice holding a note of curiosity. Naomi met his gaze, unsure how to respond. She had never questioned why she did it. It had felt instinctual, like a call she couldn't ignore. But to put it into words, she wasn't sure if she could explain. "I don't know," she said softly. "I just knew something was wrong. I couldn't let you get hurt." Dominic studied her for a long moment, his gaze piercing. Naomi couldn't read him, couldn't understand the thoughts that were running through his mind. But in that moment, it didn't matter. All that mattered was that he was here, standing before her, acknowledging her in a way no one ever had. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Dominic spoke again, his voice softer now. "You're not like the others," he said, almost as if he were thinking aloud. "You don't fear me. You just act." Naomi felt a lump form in her throat. He had always been the one in control, the one who held all the power. But now, she saw him differently. Now, she saw the man who had trusted her, who had seen something in her that no one else had. It was both terrifying and exhilarating. "I'm not afraid of you," Naomi whispered. "But I know I should be." Dominic's lips twitched, almost as if he were about to smile, but the expression quickly disappeared. He took a step closer to her, his presence overwhelming, yet strangely comforting. "You don't need to be afraid," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've already proven that you're not." Naomi's breath caught in her throat. What did that mean? What was happening between them? She wasn't sure if she was ready to find out, but for the first time, she couldn't ignore the pull she felt toward him. She wasn't invisible anymore, and neither was he. The days that followed felt like a blur to Naomi. She was no longer just the maid, the invisible woman who cleaned the grand halls and served drinks. No, now she was someone who had caught the attention of Dominic Castellano, the most powerful man she had ever known. And for reasons she still didn't fully understand, he was looking at her as if she mattered. It was a feeling Naomi was still trying to get used to. She had been taught her whole life to stay out of the spotlight, to be quiet, to blend in. But now, she found herself standing in a world she wasn't sure she belonged to, one where the boundaries between fear and respect were blurring in ways she couldn't control. Every time she crossed paths with Dominic, her heart would race. She could see the weight of his world in his eyes, the quiet intensity that seemed to follow him wherever he went. But what she hadn't expected was the kindness that would occasionally slip through, like when he had looked at her in the living room after the threat had passed. His eyes, which had once been cold and calculating, were now filled with something softer, something Naomi had never expected to see from someone like him. And that thought scared her. Naomi's world was full of questions. What did it mean for her now? What was Dominic expecting from her? She had done what she felt was right, but she wasn't sure if that would change anything between them. The next day, Dominic invited her to meet him in the garden, a private space she had only ever seen from a distance. It was a quiet corner of the estate, surrounded by lush greenery and the soft sound of water from a nearby fountain. As Naomi stepped into the garden, she noticed Dominic standing near the edge of a small pond, his back to her. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on his suit. He looked different today, less like the Mafia boss she had always seen, and more like a man lost in his own thoughts. Naomi hesitated for a moment, then slowly walked up to him. "You wanted to see me?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Dominic turned to face her, and for the first time, Naomi noticed the exhaustion in his eyes. It was as if the weight of everything he carried had finally caught up with him. "Yes," he said, his voice softer than usual. "I wanted to thank you again for what you did." Naomi felt a flutter in her chest at the sincerity in his words, but she quickly masked it with a cool exterior. "You don't need to thank me," she replied. "I just did what I had to do." Dominic took a step closer to her, his gaze never leaving hers. "No, Naomi," he said quietly. "You did more than that. You saved my life, and I owe you for that." Naomi felt a rush of emotions, but she couldn't let herself get swept away. "I didn't do it for you," she said, her voice steady. "I did it because I couldn't just stand by and watch someone get hurt." Dominic regarded her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Naomi felt like he was searching for something in her, trying to understand her, trying to understand why she had acted the way she had. "You're not like the others," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Naomi frowned, unsure of what he meant. "What do you mean?" she asked. Dominic hesitated before responding. "You don't fear me. You don't see me the way everyone else does. You saw the situation for what it was, and you acted." Naomi could feel her heart beating faster. Was that a compliment? It didn't feel like a compliment. It felt like something more, something heavier. "I don't want anything from you, Dominic," Naomi said, her voice firm. "I'm just here to do my job." Dominic's lips quirked up into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "That's the thing, Naomi," he said softly. "You've already done more than your job." Naomi swallowed hard. She didn't know how to respond to that. What was he trying to say? Was this just a passing moment of gratitude, or was there something more to it? "I don't need your protection," she said, her voice steady, but inside, she felt the first stirrings of doubt. "I can take care of myself." Dominic's smile faded slightly, and for a moment, Naomi could see the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. "I'm not offering you protection," he said, his tone serious. "I'm offering you something else." Naomi's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Dominic looked at her for a long time, as if contemplating his next words carefully. "I don't know what this is, Naomi," he said quietly, "but I know that I can't let you walk away from it. Not after everything you've done." Naomi's mind was racing. She wasn't sure what he was trying to say, but a part of her felt like she was standing at the edge of something much bigger than herself. Something she wasn't sure she could control. "I'm just a maid," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "I don't belong in your world." Dominic took a step closer to her, his voice low and steady. "You belong wherever you choose to belong," he said. "You've proven that." Naomi didn't know how to respond to that. She had always felt out of place in this world of power and danger. But now, with Dominic standing before her, looking at her like she mattered, she wasn't so sure anymore. She wasn't sure of anything, except for one thing. Her life was never going to be the same again. Naomi had never felt more out of place. As the days passed, the weight of Dominic's words lingered in her mind like an unwelcome shadow. You belong wherever you choose to belong. How could she choose where she belonged? She was just a maid, nothing more. She had always known her place, understood the unspoken rules of the world she lived in. She kept her head down, did her work, and stayed invisible. But now, Dominic's words rattled her, pulling her out of the world she had carefully constructed around herself. Every time she saw him, she felt the shift. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Dominic Castellano, the most powerful man in the city, had seen her, not just the maid, but her. And for the first time in her life, Naomi didn't know how to respond to that. Every time they crossed paths, she couldn't help but feel the weight of his gaze. It wasn't the same as before. His eyes, once cold and indifferent, now seemed to hold a depth she couldn't quite understand. He had trusted her, saved her in a way, and that was more than anyone could ask for. But what did it mean for her? What did it mean to be seen by him? Naomi had always prided herself on her independence. She had learned long ago that the only person she could rely on was herself. She didn't need anyone's help. But now, as Dominic continued to watch her, as he continued to offer her more than just protection, Naomi felt her resolve begin to crumble. She couldn't deny the pull she felt toward him. She had never been close to anyone, not in the way he was offering. But the fear of what that might mean, the fear of losing herself in this dangerous world, held her back. Dominic's presence was like a storm, sweeping through the carefully constructed walls she had built around her heart. She wasn't sure if she was ready for what that storm could bring. And yet, every time he spoke to her, every time he looked at her, she felt something inside her stir. Something that told her she couldn't ignore this feeling. She couldn't ignore him. One evening, after a long day of cleaning and serving the guests at one of Dominic's lavish parties, Naomi found herself in the kitchen, exhausted. She had long since gotten used to the quiet hours after everyone else had left, when the mansion settled into a kind of eerie calm. She had just finished washing the last of the dishes when she heard the soft sound of footsteps approaching. She turned to see Dominic standing in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dim light of the hallway. His eyes locked with hers, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. Naomi couldn't help but feel a strange sensation in her chest, a flutter she couldn't quite explain. Dominic stepped into the kitchen, his presence filling the space in a way that felt both unsettling and comforting at the same time. "I've been looking for you," he said, his voice steady but softer than usual. Naomi's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected him to seek her out like this. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice betraying the sudden nervousness she felt. Dominic shook his head, a faint smile playing at the corner of his lips. "No, nothing's wrong. I just wanted to speak to you." Naomi stood there, unsure of what to do. She had always kept a safe distance from Dominic, never allowing herself to get too close. But now, as he stood before her, she felt that distance beginning to shrink, and it made her feel more vulnerable than she had ever felt in her life. "About what?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Dominic looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "About you," he said finally, his voice low and deliberate. "About what you've done for me, and about what happens next." Naomi swallowed hard, unsure of where this conversation was headed. She had never been in a situation like this, never had to navigate the complexities of power and trust in this way. "I didn't do it for you," she said quietly, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." Dominic took a step closer, his presence overwhelming in the small kitchen. "I know," he said softly, "but that doesn't change the fact that you saved my life. That doesn't change the fact that you've earned my trust." Naomi's heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't process the words he was saying. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was just a maid. She wasn't supposed to matter to someone like him. "I'm not looking for anything from you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I just want to do my job and stay out of the way." Dominic's expression softened, and he reached out, gently lifting her chin so she was looking at him again. "Naomi," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You've already done more than your job. And you're not just in the way. You're someone I trust. He trailed off, as if searching for the right words. Naomi could feel her pulse quicken at the unspoken tension between them. She didn't know how to respond, didn't know what to say to him. But in that moment, she realized something she hadn't fully understood until now. She wasn't invisible anymore. And neither was he. For better or for worse. Their paths had crossed in a way that neither of them could ignore. I don't know what this means, Naomi said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. But I can't pretend like it doesn't matter. Dominic nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. I don't expect you to, he said. But I do expect you to be honest with me. About everything. Naomi felt her heart race as she realized the gravity of what he was saying. This wasn't just about saving his life. This was about something more. Something neither of them could walk away from. I will, she said, her voice steady now. I promise. And in that moment, as Dominic's hand lingered on her chin, Naomi knew that everything was about to change. She wasn't sure how, or when, or why. But she knew one thing for certain. There was no going back now. Naomi could feel the shift in the air as the days passed after that night in the garden. Every time she crossed paths with Dominic, there was a tension that hadn't been there before. It wasn't like the distant, cold encounters they had shared in the past. Now, when their eyes met, she felt the weight of unspoken words hanging between them, words neither of them dared to speak out loud. It wasn't just the respect he had shown her. It was something deeper, something Naomi couldn't quite understand but could no longer ignore. She had been just a maid, invisible, a mere figure in the background. But now, in his presence, she felt like she was seen in ways she had never been seen before. The mansion felt different too. The echoes of the grand hallways and the quiet hum of the estate's luxury were suddenly so much more real to her. The polished surfaces, the gleaming marble floors, everything felt distant, alien, as though she no longer belonged here. She had always been the invisible one. Now, she was caught between two worlds, the world of power and wealth that Dominic lived in, and the one she had known her whole life, the world where she worked for a living and kept her distance from people like him. But the line between those two worlds was beginning to blur, and it terrified Naomi. She was no longer just an observer. She was a part of the story. She couldn't ignore it, not anymore. One evening, after dinner, Dominic asked her to stay behind in the kitchen. She had been about to leave for the night, her shift over, when his voice stopped her. Naomi, he said, his tone different from usual, not commanding, but almost inviting. She turned to face him, her heart skipping a beat. Yes, sir? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. He didn't immediately answer. Instead, he walked toward the table where she had been preparing the evening's meal. His footsteps were quiet on the floor, but Naomi could feel the intensity of his gaze, the way he was watching her, as though trying to figure something out. You're still thinking about what happened, aren't you? He asked, finally breaking the silence. Naomi blinked, not sure how to respond. Yes, she admitted quietly. It's hard not to. Dominic's expression softened slightly, his eyes not as cold as they usually were. I know this isn't easy, he said, his voice quieter now. I don't expect you to understand everything all at once. But I need you to know that I'm grateful for what you did, and I don't take that lightly. Naomi felt a strange lump form in her throat. She had never heard him speak like this, never heard him sound so vulnerable. He had always been the one in control, the one who called the shots. But now, it felt like he was letting down his guard, just a little. And it was terrifying. I didn't do it for you, she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. I just couldn't let you get hurt. Dominic looked at her for a long moment, as if trying to process her words. You're different, he said finally. You're not like anyone else I know. You don't fear me. You just act. Naomi could feel her heart beating faster. She didn't know what he was trying to say. She didn't know how to respond. I'm just trying to survive, she said, her voice barely audible. Dominic shook his head. You don't have to survive anymore, he said, his voice low but firm. You don't have to be invisible. Naomi's breath caught in her throat. He was offering her something she didn't know how to accept. A life beyond survival. A life where she didn't have to hide in the shadows. She wasn't sure if she was ready for that. She wasn't sure if she could handle it. She had spent so many years being invisible, so many years hiding in plain sight. But now, everything was changing. She wasn't sure if she was ready to let go of her past, to step into a world where she was seen. I can't just change everything, she said, her voice shaky. I don't know how. Dominic took a step closer to her, his eyes intense but gentle. You don't have to do it alone, he said, his voice almost a whisper. You're not alone in this. Naomi felt a surge of emotions, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. She had always been alone, always had to rely on herself. But now, Dominic's words were like a lifeline, a bridge between the life she had known and the one he was offering her. I don't know what this is, she whispered, her eyes meeting his. But I'm scared. Dominic reached out, his hand brushing hers gently, and Naomi's heart skipped a beat. I'm here, he said softly. And I'll be here, no matter what. She didn't know what that meant, didn't know what the future held. But in that moment, standing there with Dominic, she felt something she had never felt before, hope. A hope she wasn't sure she was allowed to have. Okay, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Okay. And for the first time in a long time, Naomi allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could have a life outside the shadows. A life where she wasn't just the maid, but someone who mattered. To Dominic. To herself. Naomi woke the next morning to the soft sound of birds singing outside the window. The sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the room. She blinked a few times, adjusting to the light, and slowly sat up in bed. For a moment, she just stared at the room, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. It wasn't her small apartment in the city, and it wasn't the cold, impersonal rooms she was used to cleaning. This room, this space, felt different. It felt like it belonged to someone who was more than just a maid. She took a deep breath, trying to steady the unease that had settled in her chest. Last night had changed everything. Dominic's words, his presence, his touch, she couldn't stop thinking about them. She had never imagined she would find herself in a situation like this, never thought she would be at the center of the world she had spent her life avoiding. She had always been the invisible one, the one who worked in the background, unnoticed by the powerful people who passed through the mansion. But now, she was someone Dominic saw, someone who mattered. And that thought terrified her. Naomi swung her legs over the side of the bed, her feet touching the cold wooden floor. She stood up slowly, stretching her arms above her head, trying to shake off the lingering tension from the night before. She had a job to do, and she couldn't afford to get lost in her thoughts. She quickly dressed in the uniform she had grown accustomed to, the one she had worn for months. But as she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror, she couldn't help but notice how different she looked. It wasn't the uniform that had changed. It was the way she saw herself. She wasn't just Naomi, the maid. She was someone who had done something that no one else dared to do. She had acted when it mattered. She had saved Dominic's life. And that fact seemed to weigh more heavily on her now than it ever had before. After a few minutes, Naomi stepped out of the room and into the hallway. She walked quietly, her footsteps soft on the polished floors, making her way to the kitchen where she knew breakfast would be prepared. As she entered the kitchen, she was greeted by the familiar sounds of pots clinking and the smell of freshly brewed coffee. But today, it all felt different. The kitchen, once just another part of the estate she worked in, now seemed to have a deeper significance. She wasn't just here to clean and serve. She was part of something more. Good morning, Naomi, the cook said with a warm smile. Naomi returned the smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. Good morning. She quickly set to work, cutting vegetables for the breakfast table, but her mind kept wandering back to Dominic. What did he mean when he said she didn't have to be invisible anymore? She wasn't sure what that even meant. She had always been invisible. That was how she had survived. But now, it seemed like everything was changing. Dominic was changing everything. The thought made her stomach tighten. She couldn't let herself get too close to him, couldn't allow herself to get caught up in the world he lived in. It was dangerous. She knew that better than anyone. But as she continued to chop the vegetables, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was already too far in. She was already a part of his world, whether she wanted to be or not. And that scared her more than she was willing to admit. After breakfast, Naomi returned to her usual duties, moving through the estate like she had done 1,000 times before. But today, it felt different. She was different. Every glance, every conversation, felt heavier, like there was an unspoken weight behind it all. As she was cleaning one of the guest rooms, she heard footsteps in the hallway. She turned to see Dominic approaching, his figure framed by the doorway. His presence filled the room, and Naomi's heart skipped a beat. He looked at her for a moment, his gaze steady, before stepping inside. "Naomi," he said softly, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "I need to speak with you." Naomi felt a rush of anxiety, her hands suddenly clammy. She set the cleaning supplies down and met his gaze. "Yes, sir?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic walked closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "I've been thinking about what you said," he said, his tone more serious than usual. Naomi frowned, confused. "What I said?" He nodded. "About not being invisible anymore. I meant it." Naomi swallowed, her throat dry. "I don't understand," she said, her voice shaking slightly. Dominic looked at her for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to say more. Finally, he spoke. "I know you're not like the others," he said quietly. "You don't try to please me, you don't seek my approval. You just do what's right. And that's rare." Naomi could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what to say. She had never been praised like this before, never been seen in this way. Naomi began, but Dominic cut her off gently. "I know," he said. "You don't have to explain. I just want you to know that I see you. You're not invisible." Naomi's breath caught in her throat. She had never been seen by someone like him before, and that thought made her feel something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Hope. Dominic paused for a moment, his gaze softening. "I've been thinking about what happens next," he said, his voice quieter now. "And I want you to be part of it." Naomi blinked, confused. "Part of what?" "Part of my life," Dominic said simply. "Part of my world." Naomi's mind spun. She didn't know how to respond. She had never imagined that someone like Dominic Castellano would ask her to be part of his world. It was a world she had tried to stay away from, a world of power and danger. But now, as she stood before him, she realized that she wasn't just a maid anymore. She was something more, and that terrified her. "I don't know if I can," Naomi whispered. "I don't know if I'm ready for that." Dominic stepped closer, his voice gentle. "You don't have to be ready, Naomi. You just have to trust that you belong." Naomi felt her heart skip a beat. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. Her life would never be the same again. Naomi spent the next few days in a state of quiet turmoil, trying to come to terms with everything that had changed. Dominic's words echoed in her mind, his insistence that she wasn't invisible anymore, that she mattered. She had never thought of herself as someone who mattered. She had always been content to stay in the background, to do her job, and keep out of sight. But now, after everything that had happened, it felt like the walls she had built around herself were slowly starting to crumble. Every time Dominic looked at her, she felt a shiver run down her spine. It wasn't just that he was the Mafia boss, the man who controlled everything in his world. It was that he was looking at her, not as a servant, not as someone beneath him, but as someone with value, as someone worthy of his attention. And that terrified her. Naomi didn't know how to handle this new reality. She had always kept a safe distance from people like Dominic. She had learned long ago that the closer you got to people like him, the more dangerous it became. But now, she couldn't help but wonder if that distance was closing, and if she wanted it to. She had told herself that she wouldn't let herself get caught up in his world, that she wouldn't let herself become a part of the power and danger that surrounded him. But the truth was, she wasn't sure she could stay away. She wasn't sure if she even wanted to. That evening, after dinner, Dominic asked her to meet him in his private study. She had been expecting the usual summons, nothing out of the ordinary. But as she walked into the study, she was greeted by something that felt different. The room was dimly lit, the golden light from the desk lamp casting long shadows across the polished wood. Dominic was sitting at his desk, his back straight, and his gaze focused on the papers in front of him. But when he saw her enter, he stood up and walked toward her, his steps deliberate and measured. "Naomi," he said softly, his voice low but steady. "I've been thinking about everything. About what you did for me." Naomi felt a flicker of unease stir in her chest. She had done what anyone would have done. She had warned him, but she hadn't expected him to keep bringing it up. "I told you, Dominic," she said quietly, trying to keep her voice steady. "I didn't do it for you. I did it because it was the right thing to do." Dominic studied her for a moment, his gaze intense, as if trying to read something in her expression. "I know," he said, his voice softening. "But it wasn't just the right thing to do. It was something more." Naomi's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic stepped closer to her, his eyes never leaving hers. I mean that you did something that no one else would have done, he said quietly. You put yourself at risk for me. You made a choice. And that's not something I take lightly. Naomi could feel her breath catch in her throat. She had never thought of it that way. She had just acted on instinct, doing what she thought was right. She hadn't expected it to mean anything more than that. But now, as Dominic stood before her, she realized that he was seeing it in a way she hadn't anticipated. I don't want anything from you, Dominic, she said, trying to hold her ground. I just want to do my job. I don't want to be involved in whatever world you're in. Dominic's expression softened, and he took another step closer, so close that Naomi could feel the warmth of his presence. You already are involved, he said quietly. You don't have a choice in that. Whether you want to admit it or not, you're part of my world now. Naomi's heart pounded in her chest. I don't belong in your world, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I'm just a maid. Dominic reached out and gently cupped her chin, tilting her face up so she was looking directly at him. His touch was warm, almost reassuring. You're not just a maid, he said softly. You're someone I trust. Someone who has proven herself to me in ways that most people never will. Naomi's mind was spinning. She had never expected this. She had never imagined that Dominic Castellano, the man who had everything, would look at her like this. She had always kept her distance from people like him, always told herself that she didn't belong in that world. But now, with him standing so close, with his hand gently holding her chin, she couldn't deny the pull she felt toward him. I don't know if I can do this, Naomi whispered, her voice trembling. I don't know if I can be part of your world. Dominic's thumb brushed gently across her cheek. You don't have to be anything you're not, Naomi, he said quietly. But I want you to know that you're more than just the maid. You're someone I value, and you don't have to be afraid of that. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment, letting his words wash over her. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that she couldn't keep running from it. She couldn't keep hiding. When she opened her eyes, Dominic was still standing in front of her, his gaze steady and unwavering. I don't know what happens next, Naomi said softly, but I'll stay. Dominic's lips curved into a small, almost imperceptible smile. Good, he said quietly, because I'm not letting you go. Naomi didn't know what it meant, didn't know what was coming next. But for the first time, she felt like she was standing on the edge of something real. Something she wasn't sure she was ready for, but something she knew she couldn't walk away from. As Dominic's hand gently slid from her chin, Naomi took a deep breath, preparing herself for whatever came next. She had made her choice. And now, there was no turning back. Naomi had always prided herself on her ability to keep her distance, to stay invisible, to blend into the background. But now, as she sat across from Dominic Castellano in the mansion's expansive library, she couldn't help but feel everything shifting around her. The walls that had once felt so solid and secure were starting to crumble. She had spent her entire life keeping her emotions locked away, hiding from the world, from people who could hurt her. But Dominic was different. She had never expected to find herself in this position, sitting in front of the most powerful man in the city, someone who could change her life with a single word. And yet, here she was, uncertain and vulnerable, grappling with emotions she didn't know how to handle. The soft light from the chandeliers overhead cast long shadows across the room, and Naomi felt the weight of the silence between them. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know what he wanted from her, or if she was even capable of giving it. Dominic was leaning back in his chair, his fingers tapping idly on the desk in front of him. His usual confident demeanor was still present, but Naomi could see the subtle shift in his expression, the way his gaze softened when it landed on her. She had never seen him like this before. There was something different about the way he was looking at her now. It wasn't the detached, calculating gaze he reserved for his enemies or even his business associates. It was gentler, almost like he was waiting for something from her. Naomi felt a flicker of panic rise in her chest. She couldn't let herself get too caught up in this. She had always known her place in the world, and that place was nowhere near the high-powered circles Dominic moved in. She was just the maid, the one who kept the mansion running behind the scenes. But Dominic had seen something in her. He had given her something she hadn't had in a long time, attention. And now, Naomi didn't know what to do with it. Naomi, Dominic said softly, breaking the silence, his voice low but steady. I need to know something. Naomi looked up at him, her heart racing. What did he want to know? Was he about to send her away, back to the shadows where she belonged? Was this all just some temporary distraction for him? What do you need to know? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dominic's eyes locked with hers, his gaze intense. I need to know what you want. Naomi's breath caught in her throat. What she wanted. She had spent so many years hiding from what she wanted, burying her dreams and desires in order to survive. What did she want now? She wasn't sure. She had never allowed herself the luxury of thinking about her wants. She had always focused on getting through each day, on making sure the bills were paid, and that she didn't draw too much attention to herself. I don't know, she said quietly, her voice shaking slightly. I never really thought about it. Dominic leaned forward, his eyes never leaving hers. You should think about it, he said, his voice gentle but firm. What do you want, Naomi? You've already proven that you're capable of more than just cleaning and serving. You've shown me that you can stand up for what's right. Naomi swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. The idea of having a choice, of being able to decide what she wanted, was both overwhelming and terrifying. She had always done what was expected of her. She had always been the one who took the back seat, who stayed in the shadows. But now, Dominic was asking her what she wanted. He was offering her something she had never had before, the chance to take control of her own life. I never thought I had a choice, Naomi whispered. I've always just done what I had to do. Dominic's gaze softened, and he stood up from his chair, walking around the desk toward her. He didn't say anything at first, but Naomi could feel the weight of his presence, the way he seemed to fill the room with his energy. He stopped in front of her, and for a moment, they just stood there, the tension between them thick and palpable. You do have a choice, he said quietly, his voice low, and I want to help you make it. Naomi looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest. What did he mean by that? How could he help her make a choice? She wasn't sure if she was ready for what he was offering. She wasn't sure if she was ready to step into his world, to accept the power he was offering her. What do you want from me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic's eyes softened even more, and he reached out, gently brushing a lock of hair away from her face. I don't want anything from you, Naomi, he said softly. I just want to give you the opportunity to choose. You're not just a maid to me. You're more than that. And I want you to know that. Naomi's heart skipped a beat. He had said it again. She wasn't just a maid. She was more than that. The words resonated deep within her, filling her with a sense of warmth she had never known before. But as quickly as the warmth spread, fear followed. She didn't know if she could handle this, if she could allow herself to step into the world he was offering her. I'm not sure I'm ready for this, she said, her voice trembling. I've always been invisible. I don't know how to be anything else. Dominic's hand gently cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing across her skin. You don't have to be invisible anymore, he said softly. You've already shown me who you really are. You don't need to hide. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of his words settle over her. She didn't know if she could walk away from the life she had known, the life that had kept her safe, even if it meant staying hidden. But she also didn't know if she could continue to live in the shadows, never allowing herself to be seen. Dominic was offering her something she hadn't even realized she wanted, a chance to step out of the shadows and into the light. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure if she could say no. I don't know what's going to happen, Naomi whispered, her voice full of uncertainty. But I'm willing to try. Dominic's eyes softened even further, and for the first time, Naomi saw a flicker of something she hadn't expected, hope. That's all I'm asking, he said quietly. And in that moment, Naomi realized that the life she had always known was slipping away. There was no going back now. She had made her choice, and there was no turning back. Naomi sat in the quiet of the mansion, her mind racing with everything that had happened. The past few days felt like a blur, a whirlwind of emotions and decisions she hadn't planned for. She had always been the quiet one, the one who stayed in the background, invisible to everyone around her. But now, nothing was the same. Dominic's words still echoed in her ears. You don't have to be invisible anymore. She had never imagined that anyone, least of all someone like Dominic Castellano, would ever see her, truly see her, for more than just the maid. The fear that had always held her back, the fear of stepping out of the shadows, had been replaced with something else, something that terrified her just as much. Hope. Dominic had offered her something she never thought she would have: a choice. A chance to live a life outside the confines of her job. A chance to be more than just invisible. It was a chance to step into a world she had always tried to avoid. A world of power, wealth, and danger. But what did that mean for her? What did it mean to be a part of Dominic's world? Naomi didn't know, but she knew she couldn't ignore it anymore. She had made a choice, and now there was no turning back. She stood up from the chair, her body moving on its own, almost as if it knew what she was going to do before she did. She walked through the mansion, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallways, the soft sound of her shoes against the marble floors the only noise in the stillness. She reached the door to Dominic's office, her hand resting on the handle. She hesitated for a moment, uncertainty creeping in, but then she pushed the door open. Inside, Dominic was standing by the window, looking out at the city below. He didn't hear her enter, but she didn't mind. She wanted him to know she was there, to know that she had made her decision. "Dominic," she said, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. He turned to face her, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart race. He didn't say anything at first, just watched her, as if waiting for her to speak. Naomi stepped forward, her gaze never leaving his. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "About everything you said. About what happens next." Dominic raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that made her feel like he was waiting for her to make the next move. "And?" he asked softly. Naomi swallowed hard, gathering the courage to speak the words that had been on her mind. "And I'm ready," she said, her voice more confident now. "I'm ready to step into this world. I'm ready to stop hiding." The room fell silent, the only sound the soft hum of the air conditioning in the background. Dominic didn't move, didn't say anything for what felt like an eternity. But then, slowly, he walked toward her, his gaze never leaving hers. He stopped just a few feet away, his presence overwhelming in the small space. "You don't have to do this, Naomi," he said, his voice low and steady. "You don't have to be a part of this if you don't want to. I won't force you." Naomi shook her head. "I want to," she said, her voice firm. "I don't want to live in the shadows anymore. I want to be seen. I want to matter." Dominic's gaze softened, and for the first time since they had met, Naomi saw a flicker of something in his eyes, something like tenderness, like understanding. "You matter," he said quietly. "You've always mattered." The words hit her harder than she expected, like a wave crashing over her. She had never been told that she mattered, never been made to feel like she was more than just the maid. But Dominic, in that moment, made her feel like she was something more, something worth paying attention to. She looked up at him, meeting his gaze, and for the first time, she didn't feel afraid. "So what happens now?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with uncertainty. Dominic stepped closer, his presence wrapping around her like a comforting embrace. "Now," he said, his voice soft, "we take it one step at a time. We build something new. Together." Naomi's heart fluttered in her chest. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she was willing to find out. She was ready to walk into this new world, to take her place in it, to stop hiding and start living. Dominic extended his hand to her, and without thinking, Naomi reached out and took it. She felt the warmth of his touch, the strength of his hand as he held hers. And in that moment, she knew that whatever came next, she wasn't alone. "Are you sure about this?" Dominic asked, his voice barely above a whisper, his eyes searching hers for some sign of hesitation. Naomi smiled, the uncertainty in her chest slowly fading away. "Yes," she said, her voice full of conviction. "I'm sure." Dominic's smile was small but genuine, and he squeezed her hand gently. "Then welcome to my world, Naomi," he said softly. And for the first time, Naomi felt like she truly belonged. She wasn't just the maid. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was something more. And this was only the beginning. Naomi had never imagined that life could change so quickly, and yet, here she was, standing at the precipice of something she could not fully comprehend. The mansion that once felt like an impersonal backdrop to her daily routines now seemed to pulse with meaning. Every room, every corner, every hallway was filled with a weight of possibility she had never allowed herself to entertain. It wasn't just about the power or the luxury of it all. It was about the fact that she had stepped into a world she was always told she didn't belong to. She had always kept her distance, kept her head down, and stayed out of the way. But with Dominic's invitation into his life, into his world, everything was different. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't just the maid. And that terrified her. The past few days had been a blur. Conversations with Dominic, small gestures, moments where their eyes met, and she felt a connection she had never expected. They didn't speak much about the future, but Naomi could feel it hanging between them, heavy with unspoken words. She had never thought that someone like Dominic Castellano, someone so powerful, so untouchable, would ever take interest in someone like her. But there it was. He had shown her a side of himself that no one else ever saw. The tenderness, the vulnerability hidden beneath his cold exterior. The more time they spent together, the more Naomi realized how little she understood the man standing before her. He was still the Mafia boss, the one who controlled everything. But in his eyes, there was something more, something deeper, and that made her feel both seen and afraid. It was late afternoon when Naomi found herself standing outside the mansion's grand front doors, looking out at the garden that stretched beyond. The soft sound of the wind rustling the leaves and the distant hum of the city filled the air, but for Naomi, the noise of her thoughts drowned out everything else. She had made a choice. She had stepped into this world, this dangerous, beautiful world. But now, she wasn't sure what to do with it. She had always been able to rely on herself. That's how she had survived all these years. But Dominic's world, his power, his influence, was something she couldn't navigate on her own, and she didn't know if she was ready to let him help her. "Hey!" Soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts, and Naomi turned to see Dominic standing there, looking as composed as ever. His gaze softened when he saw her, but there was an intensity in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. "I didn't mean to interrupt your thinking," he said quietly, stepping into the room. Naomi shook her head, forcing a smile. "It's fine. I was just thinking." She didn't know what she had been thinking about, really. She had been trying to make sense of everything that had happened, but the more she thought about it, the more confused she felt. Dominic didn't speak at first, his gaze searching her face as if trying to gauge what was going on in her mind. Finally, he stepped closer, closing the distance between them. "I've been thinking too," he said, his voice soft but steady. "About us. About what happens next." Naomi's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't realized how badly she wanted to know what he thought about all of this, about her, about the choice she had made. "And?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic paused for a moment, his gaze never leaving hers. "I think we need to talk," he said finally. Naomi felt a tightness in her chest. She had been avoiding this conversation, avoiding the reality of what it meant to step into his world. But now, standing before him, she realized there was no avoiding it anymore. "About what?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Dominic took another step closer to her, his presence filling the space between them. "About what you want," he said softly. "About what we both want." Naomi's breath caught in her throat. What did he mean by that? She hadn't been expecting him to ask for something like that, to demand an answer. She had always kept her desires hidden, tucked away in a corner of her mind. But Dominic had a way of pulling things out of her she didn't even realize were there. "I don't know what I want," she said quietly. "I just know I don't want to be invisible anymore. I don't want to hide." Dominic's expression softened. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek, his thumb brushing against her skin. "You've never been invisible to me," he said softly. Naomi's heart raced at the tenderness in his touch, at the sincerity in his words. She had never known this side of him, this quiet side, the one that wasn't about power or control. It was the side of him that was human. "I've always been the one in the background," Naomi continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've always been the one people don't notice." Dominic's thumb lingered on her cheek, his gaze steady. "Not anymore," he said simply. "You're not in the background anymore. You're right here with me." Naomi felt a flood of emotions surge through her. Fear, confusion, and something else she wasn't sure she could name. But most of all, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Hope. The kind of hope that came from believing that maybe, just maybe, she could have a life outside the shadows. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," Naomi whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Dominic leaned in, his face inches from hers. "You don't have to be ready," he said, his voice low and comforting. You just have to trust me. Trust us. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment, taking in a slow breath. She wasn't sure where this path would lead, or what kind of life it would bring her. But she knew one thing. She couldn't walk away from it. She had already taken that first step, and there was no going back now. She opened her eyes to meet Dominic's gaze, her voice steady but full of uncertainty. I trust you, she said quietly. Dominic smiled, the kind of smile that was rare for him, and for a moment, Naomi felt like everything was going to be okay. Maybe not perfect, but something real, something she could hold on to. Good, he said softly. Then let's see where this takes us. And for the first time in a long time, Naomi allowed herself to believe that she wasn't just part of the background anymore. She was part of the story, Dominic's story, and maybe, just maybe, she could finally have a place in it. One that was hers, one that was real. Naomi had never imagined that stepping into Dominic's world would feel so complicated. In the days that followed their conversation, everything felt different. The mansion, once a cold and distant place, now felt more like a space she was beginning to understand, and yet, she still felt like an outsider. She wasn't invisible anymore, but sometimes it was hard to shake the feeling that she wasn't truly a part of this world. She had always known her place, the small room she retreated to after her long shifts, the silent routine that kept her safe from drawing attention. But now, Dominic had given her more than just a job. He had given her a choice, a place at his side in a world that was foreign and overwhelming. Every time their paths crossed, Naomi found herself at a loss for words. She wasn't used to this closeness, to the quiet moments where Dominic's presence filled the space between them. She had always kept her distance from people like him, the ones with power and influence. She had learned to remain unnoticed, to stay in the background, because she knew that getting too close to someone like Dominic could be dangerous. But now, everything was changing. Dominic had proven time and time again that he saw her as more than just the maid. And that truth was slowly shifting everything Naomi thought she knew about herself. The first time she joined him in one of the private meetings with his associates, she felt the weight of their gazes, the scrutiny in their eyes as they sized her up. She wasn't sure if it was because she didn't belong, or if it was because they had seen something in her, something Dominic had seen. She wasn't sure if it was a compliment or a threat. But Dominic never flinched. He treated her with the same calm authority he showed everyone else, guiding her through the conversation, making sure she felt a part of it, even when the tension in the room was palpable. You've got a sharp mind, Naomi, one of the men had said to her, his voice laced with approval. But Naomi could hear the underlying doubt in his tone. Don't get used to this. People like you don't belong here. Naomi had smiled politely, but inside, she felt the sting of the words. She wasn't sure if they meant anything. She wasn't sure if she cared. But Dominic's eyes never left hers, and for the first time, she saw something in his gaze that made her believe she was worth more than just the life she had known. They'll come around, Dominic had told her later that night, his voice low, his hand resting on her shoulder. You don't need their approval. You have mine. Naomi had never expected to hear those words. She wasn't used to being seen, to being valued, to being acknowledged in a way that didn't involve her work or her place. Dominic wasn't just offering her a role in his world. He was offering her a chance to define herself in ways she had never imagined. As time passed, Naomi found herself growing more comfortable in his world. She spent more time with him, not just in business meetings, but in quiet moments, in the spaces where he wasn't the Mafia boss, but just Dominic. They would sit together in his study, discussing everything from books to the small details of his empire. And with every conversation, Naomi found herself learning more about him, about his past, his vulnerabilities, and the things that shaped him into the man he was. One evening, as they sat on the terrace overlooking the city, Dominic turned to her with a soft smile, the evening breeze ruffling his dark hair. I never thought I'd find someone like you in my world, he said, his voice low and sincere. Naomi looked up at him, her heart beating a little faster at the honesty in his words. Someone who isn't afraid of me, he continued. Someone who doesn't see me for what I am, but for who I am. Naomi didn't know what to say to that. She wasn't afraid of Dominic, not in the way others were. She had never been afraid of him, not because she didn't understand the danger he represented, but because she knew that in him, there was more than just power. I don't know how I ended up here, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. But I'm glad I did. Dominic's smile widened, and for a moment, it was just the two of them, alone in the quiet evening, the world outside forgotten. I'm glad too, he said, his hand gently brushing hers. You've become more than just a part of my world, Naomi. You've become a part of me. The words took Naomi by surprise, but they didn't scare her like she thought they would. They felt right, as if they had been waiting to be spoken. In the days that followed, Naomi found herself thinking about Dominic's words, about the life she was slowly beginning to build with him. She didn't have all the answers yet, didn't know where this path would lead, but for the first time, she felt like she was in control of her own future. She wasn't just a bystander anymore. She was someone who had a place, a purpose. And as she stood beside Dominic, watching the sun set over the city, she realized that everything she had been running from, the danger, the uncertainty, the unknown, was now the very thing that made her feel alive. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing for sure. She was no longer invisible. And with Dominic by her side, she wasn't afraid to face whatever came next. Naomi had spent so many years hiding in plain sight, keeping her emotions buried, never allowing herself to be more than what was expected of her. But everything had changed. Dominic's presence in her life had turned everything upside down, and now, standing at the crossroads of the life she had known and the life she was slowly building, Naomi didn't know what to do. She had chosen to step into his world, to accept the role he had offered her, but there were moments, like tonight, when the weight of it all seemed almost too much to bear. They had spent the evening together, talking, laughing even, but there was an underlying tension between them, an unspoken understanding that neither of them knew what came next. Naomi felt as if she was living in a dream. She had never thought she would be here, standing next to Dominic, someone she had once only seen from a distance. She had never thought that she would matter in this world of wealth and power, a world she had tried to avoid for so long. But here she was, and the more time she spent with Dominic, the more she realized just how much she had underestimated him. Dominic wasn't just the cold, calculating Mafia boss everyone talked about. There was something more to him, something deeper. She saw it in the way he looked at her when no one else was around, in the way his hand brushed against hers when they were alone. It wasn't about power or control. It was about trust. And for the first time in Naomi's life, she was starting to believe that she could trust someone else. She had always done everything on her own, but with Dominic, it felt different. It felt like maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to carry the weight of everything by herself anymore. She wasn't sure when that shift had happened, but it had. And now, as she sat in the quiet of his office, with the moonlight filtering through the curtains, Naomi felt something stir deep inside her, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Something like hope. Dominic was standing by the window, looking out at the city, his back to her. Naomi could feel the space between them, but it didn't feel like distance. It felt like an invitation to step closer, to let down the walls she had built around herself for so long. She stood up slowly, the sound of her footsteps soft against the floor. Dominic, she said, her voice quiet, unsure. He turned around at the sound of her voice, his gaze immediately locking with hers. Naomi, he said, his voice deep and steady. I didn't expect you to be here tonight. Naomi hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say. I needed to talk to you, she said finally, her heart racing. Dominic took a few steps toward her, his eyes never leaving hers. What about? He asked softly. Naomi swallowed hard. She didn't know how to explain what she was feeling, didn't know how to put it into words. I don't know what this is, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I feel like I'm in over my head. I've never been part of something like this before. Dominic stepped closer to her, his presence almost overwhelming. You don't have to have all the answers, Naomi, he said, his voice gentle. I'm not asking you to figure it all out right now. I'm asking you to trust me. Trust us. Naomi's breath caught in her throat. She had never been good at trusting people, had always kept her guard up, never letting anyone get too close. But with Dominic, it was different. She felt something in her heart tell her that maybe, just maybe, she could trust him. She could trust herself. I'm scared, Naomi admitted, her voice trembling. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what I'm supposed to feel. Dominic's expression softened, and he reached out, gently taking her hand in his. That's okay, he said softly. You don't have to have it all figured out. I'm here for you. And I'll be here, no matter what. Naomi felt her heart beat faster, her pulse racing at the warmth of his touch. She had never known comfort like this, not from anyone else. Not from her family. Not from the people she had trusted in the past. But Dominic. Dominic had shown her something different. Something real. He wasn't just offering her protection or a place by his side. He was offering her a chance to be seen, to be heard, to be valued for who she truly was. And in that moment, Naomi realized just how much she had longed for this. To matter. To be more than just the maid. To be someone worthy of love, worthy of trust. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew that with Dominic, she was no longer invisible. I want to trust you, Naomi said, her voice barely above a whisper. I want to believe that this is real. Dominic smiled softly, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite name. It's real, he said gently. And it always has been. Naomi felt a tear slip down her cheek, a tear she hadn't known she was holding back. I don't know how to do this, she whispered. I've always been alone. Dominic wiped the tear away with his thumb, his touch soft and reassuring. You're not alone anymore, Naomi, he said quietly. Not with me. The words hung in the air between them, and for the first time in a long time, Naomi allowed herself to believe them. She wasn't invisible. She wasn't alone. She had a place in this world, and Dominic had given her that place. She had made her choice. She had stepped into his world, and in that moment, she knew there was no going back. But maybe, just maybe, that wasn't something she wanted to do. With Dominic by her side, she was ready to face whatever came next, ready to build a life that was hers, one step at a time.